At exactly 12:47 a.m., my phone rang. French number. Unknown caller. Middle of the night. I almost didn't answer, but something told me this wasn't a normal call. When I picked up, the voice on the other end was shaking, not with anger, with desperation. President Traoré, this is Emmanuel Macron. I need to speak with you urgently. What I'm about to ask you, nobody can know about this conversation. What happened in the next 43 minutes would change the relationship between France and Africa forever. And what Macron begged me for, what he was willing to offer in exchange, will shock you. My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I'm 36 years old. I'm the president of Burkina Faso. And today I'm going to tell you exactly what happened on that midnight call. Word for word, request for request. Because what Macron asked for proves something I've been saying for years. France's control over Africa isn't power. It's desperation disguised as dominance. And when desperate people call you at midnight, they're not calling from a position of strength. They're calling because they're losing, and they know it. Stay with me for the next 30 minutes, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you understand the relationship between France and Africa, forever. The call that wasn't supposed to happen. Let me start by telling you what makes this midnight call so unprecedented. French presidents don't call African presidents at midnight. They summon us to Paris. They send ambassadors with suggestions. They arrange formal meetings with formal agendas. They don't call at 12:47 a.m. with shaking voices asking nobody can know about this conversation. That's not how France operates. That's not how they've operated for 60 years. But on February 2nd, 2025, Emmanuel Macron broke every rule of French-African diplomacy. And the reason why tells you everything you need to know about what's really happening behind the scenes. Because 3 days before that call, I had done something that terrified the French government. Something that threatened to unravel 60 years of French control over West Africa. Something that made Macron realize he was running out of time. What happened 3 days before the call on January 30th, 2026? I signed an agreement that France had spent 6 months trying to prevent. It was a direct trade agreement with 7 West African nations, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, and Benin, that would bypass the CFA franc entirely. Let me explain what that means. For 60 years, 14 African countries have been forced to use a currency controlled by France, the CFA francs. Every transaction, every trade, every business deal, France takes a cut. France controls the value. France decides monetary policy. It's colonialism with a currency instead of soldiers. But this new agreement, the West African Trade Alliance, created a framework where our 7 nations could trade directly with each other, using our own currencies. No French control, no permission needed. The agreement was worth $47 billion in annual trade, trade that had been going through French-controlled systems, trade that had been generating fees, taxes, and influence for France. And in one signature, I had cut France out of $47 billion in African trade. That's what made Macron pick up the phone at midnight 3 days later. Not diplomacy, panic. The first 3 minutes, the tone you've never heard when Macron's call connected, the first thing that struck me was his tone. I've spoken to Macron before, at international summits, in formal meetings, in diplomatic exchanges. He's always controlled, always measured, always speaking from a position of assumed superiority. But at 12:47 a.m., there was no superiority. There was urgency bordering on desperation. President Traoré, he began, and I could hear him taking a breath like he was steadying himself. I'm calling you personally, because this situation has reached a critical point. The agreement you signed 3 days ago, we need to discuss alternatives. We need to find a solution that works for everyone. Notice the language. We need to find a solution. Not you need to reconsider. Not France demands. Not even I'm asking you to. We. As if we were partners. As if France wasn't the country that had controlled West African economies for 6 decades. As if this was a conversation between equals. That's when I knew. He was negotiating from weakness, not strength. And when powerful people negotiate from weakness, they reveal things they'd never reveal otherwise. What Macron begged for. First request. After 3 minutes of diplomatic language, Macron got to his first request. And I need you to understand. What he asked for wasn't what I expected. President Traoré, he said, and his voice had shifted to something almost pleading. I need you to delay the implementation of the West African Trade Alliance. Not cancel it, just delay it. 6 months, maybe a year. Give us time to adjust our systems. Delay it. That was the first request. Not cancel it and we'll make you an offer. Not reconsider and we'll negotiate. Just delay it. And the reason he gave was even more revealing. Give us time to adjust our systems. What systems? The systems that had been extracting wealth from Africa for 60 years. The systems that depended on the CFA franc. The systems that required African trade to flow through French-controlled channels. those systems, and they needed time to adjust because without African trade flowing through them, they would collapse. That's not strength asking for accommodation. That's dependence begging for survival time. But here's what made this even more shocking. What Macron offered in exchange. The first offer, what France was willing to give up. If you delay implementation, Macron continued, France is prepared to reduce our military presence in West Africa by 40%. We'll close 3 bases. We'll reduce troop deployments. We'll transition to a purely advisory role in regional security. Let me pause here so you understand what he just offered. For 60 years, France has maintained military bases in West Africa. Not for our security, for French interests. Those bases gave France leverage, influence, control. They were symbols of French power that never left after colonialism officially ended. And Macron just offered to reduce that presence by 40%. Close 3 bases. Step back from military operations. He was offering to give up military positions that France had fought to maintain for 6 decades, just for a delay. Not even for me to cancel the agreement, just to postpone it. That's when I realized this wasn't a negotiation about one trade agreement. This was a negotiation about the entire framework of French-African relations, and France was losing. But I didn't accept his first offer, because I wanted to know how desperate he really was. My response, testing the desperation. President Macron, I said, keeping my voice calm, I appreciate your offer, but France's military presence in West Africa isn't mine to negotiate. That's between France and the countries hosting those bases. What I can negotiate is Burkina Faso's participation in the trade alliance, and I'm not interested in delaying it. Silence. 10 seconds of silence that felt like 10 minutes. Then Macron's voice came back, and this time there was something in it I'd never heard from a French president before. Vulnerability. President Traoré, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about trade. This isn't just about the CFA franc. If this alliance succeeds, if 7 West African nations prove they can trade independently without French systems, it will spread. Mali will want in. Chad will follow. Gabon will reconsider their position. Within 5 years, France will have no economic influence in West Africa. And that's not something my government can accept. He just said the quiet part out loud. The part French presidents never admit. France's entire African strategy depends on African countries believing they need France, that they can't trade without French systems, that independence is impossible. But the West African Trade Alliance proves that's a lie. And once that lie is exposed in 7 countries, it collapses everywhere. That's what Macron was really calling about. Not one trade agreement. The entire foundation of French-African relations. The second request, desperation increases. What would it take? Macron asked, and now his voice had shifted to something that sounded almost personal. For you to reconsider, not the entire alliance. Just Burkina Faso's participation. If Burkina Faso withdraws, the alliance loses credibility. It loses momentum. It becomes just another failed Pan-African initiative. He was right. Burkina Faso withdrawing would damage the alliance's credibility. We're the symbolic center of West African resistance to French control. If I pulled out, other countries would question their participation. Macron knew this, and he was betting that I had a price. What can France offer you personally? He continued. Infrastructure investment, debt forgiveness, security guarantees, presidential support at the African Union, name it. This is important. He wasn't offering things to Burkina Faso anymore. He was asking what France could offer me personally. That's not diplomacy. That's desperation approaching bribery. And that's when I decided to make him say the thing he was avoiding. Forcing Macron to admit the truth. President Macron, I said, and I made sure my voice was firm. I'm not interested in personal offers, but I am interested in understanding something. Why did you call me at midnight? Why not send your foreign minister? Why not arrange a formal summit? Why call me personally at 12:47 a.m. asking that nobody know about this conversation? Another silence. Longer this time. 15 seconds. Then Macron said something I never expected a French president to admit. Because if my government knew I was making these offers, they would stop me. If the French public knew I was negotiating from this position, my presidency would be over. If other African leaders knew how far I was willing to go to stop this alliance, they would realize how weak France's position actually is. There it was. The admission I was waiting for. France's strength in Africa is an illusion, and the illusion only works if nobody tests it. The moment African countries actually assert independence, actual independence, not symbolic independence, France has no real leverage. They can't colonize us again. They can't force us militarily without international backlash. They can't economically sanction us without hurting their own interests. All they have is the illusion that we need them. And once that illusion breaks, they have nothing. Macron just admitted that. At 12:47 a.m., In a conversation he begged me to keep secret. The third request, the shocking one. But then Macron said something that shocked even me. President Traoré, I'm going to make you an offer that I'm not authorized to make. An offer that could end my presidency if it became public. But I'm making it anyway because I think you're the only person who might understand what I'm trying to do. I waited. What if, Macron continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. France offered to end the CFA franc system entirely, not reform it, end it, give full monetary sovereignty to every African nation currently using it. In exchange, you help me do it gradually, over 5 years, in a way that doesn't collapse French-African economic relations overnight. I need you to understand what he just offered. The CFA franc is the foundation of French control over 14 African economies. It's how France maintains influence. It's how they extract wealth. It's the system that has survived every attempt at reform for 60 years. And Macron just offered to end it. Completely. But here's the catch. He needed me to help him do it gradually, in a way that doesn't collapse French-African economic relations. Translation. He needed me to help France maintain some influence while they give up the control they've had for 60 years. He was offering to end French monetary colonialism if I helped make it look like it wasn't a total French defeat. Why this offer is more complicated than it seems. Now, you might be thinking, that's a win. France ending the CFA franc is exactly what African leaders have wanted for decades. And you're right, it is. But here's the complication. Macron was offering to end the CFA franc in exchange for me delaying the West African Trade Alliance, which means France maintains control for 5 more years while they gradually transition. 5 years where they can rebuild influence. 5 years where they can create new systems of control. 5 years where African economies remain dependent on French systems while France adjusts. This wasn't freedom. This was managed decline. French control ending slowly enough that France could adapt and maintain influence through other means. But here's what made it truly complicated. If I refused, and the West African Trade Alliance succeeded, France might fight it with everything they have. Economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, support for opposition groups. They might burn the whole thing down rather than let it succeed. But if I accepted, France would give up monetary control willingly, but slowly. And in that slowness, they might find ways to maintain influence we haven't even thought of yet. This was the real negotiation. Not whether France would give up control, but whether they'd give it up all at once or slowly enough to maintain some power. My response, what I told Macron, President Macron, I said, and I made sure he heard every word clearly. I appreciate your offer, and I understand the political risk you're taking by making it, but I'm going to be honest with you about something. African independence isn't something France gets to manage. It's not something you can negotiate a timeline for. It's not something we need your permission to achieve gradually or rapidly. The West African Trade Alliance isn't a negotiation with France. It's African countries deciding how to trade with each other. France doesn't get a vote. France doesn't get to slow it down. France doesn't get to manage how fast we move toward the independence we should have had 60 years ago. So here's my counteroffer. France can end the CFA franc system tomorrow, unilaterally, without African countries having to help you do it gradually. Just announce it, end it, give us full monetary sovereignty, and in exchange I'll do something for you. I'll publicly acknowledge that France made the right choice. I'll say that Macron had the courage to end a system that should never have existed. I'll help you frame it as leadership instead of defeat. But I won't delay the trade alliance. I won't slow down African independence to make France's transition comfortable. I won't trade our future for France's face-saving. Silence again. 20 seconds this time. Then Macron said something that told me everything about where France really stands. I can't do that. I can't just end the CFA franc tomorrow. My government would fall. The French economy would struggle. Our relationship with 14 African nations would collapse overnight. I need time. And that's when I understood. Macron wasn't calling to negotiate African independence. He was calling to negotiate how much longer France could delay it. The final exchange, what we both knew. President Macron, I said, and my voice was gentle but firm. You called me at midnight because you know something has changed. You know that African countries don't need French permission anymore. You know that the systems France built to control us are failing. You know that the next generation of African leaders won't ask for independence. They'll just take it. And you're calling me because you think I might be reasonable enough to help you manage that transition, to help France decline gracefully instead of collapsing dramatically. But here's what you need to understand. I'm not reasonable. I'm just honest. And the honest truth is that France's control over Africa is ending. Not in 5 years. Not gradually. It's ending now. The only question is whether France accepts that reality or fights it. Another long silence. Then Macron's voice came back, and this time it was resigned. So there's nothing I can offer you, nothing that would make you reconsider. You could offer Burkina Faso genuine partnership, I replied. Trade between equals, investment without strings, cooperation without control. France has expertise we could benefit from, technology we could use, but not under systems where France maintains power over our decisions. If France wants a relationship with Africa, build it on respect, not control, on partnership, not dependency, on equality, not dominance. That's what you can offer, but it requires France to give up power without getting anything in return, and I don't think your government is ready for that. No, Macron said quietly, they're not, and that was the end of the negotiation, not with an agreement, with an admission. What Macron said in the last 90 seconds, the call should have ended there, but it didn't. In the last 90 seconds, Macron said something that wasn't a negotiation. It was almost like a confession. President Traoré, can I tell you something off the record? Something I can't say publicly? Go ahead. I think you're right. I think France's relationship with Africa is built on systems that shouldn't exist. I think the CFA franc is indefensible. I think French military bases in sovereign African nations are colonialism with a different name. But I'm the president of France, not the president of Franco-African relations. And my job is to protect French interests, even when those interests are built on systems I personally find unjust. So I called you tonight, hoping you'd help me find a middle way. A way to reform these systems slowly enough that France doesn't collapse, but fast enough that Africa gets the independence it deserves. But you're not interested in middle ways. You're interested in justice. And justice doesn't negotiate timelines. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just listened. I respect that, Macron continued. I don't agree with it strategically, but I respect it morally. And I think not because you're stronger than France, but because your position is morally clear, and mine isn't. And in the long run, moral clarity wins. Then he paused, and his last words were almost whispered. Good luck, President Traoré. I think you're going to need it. Not because France will fight you, though we will, but because building something new is always harder than tearing down something old. And you're trying to build a new Africa while the old systems are still fighting for survival. And then he hung up. The call lasted 43 minutes. And in those 43 minutes, the President of France admitted things I never thought I'd hear a French leader acknowledge. What happened after the call? I sat in my office for an hour after that call, thinking about what it meant. Macron had called me at midnight, begged me to delay African independence, offered to end the CFA franc if I gave him 5 years, admitted France's position was morally indefensible, and then wished me luck building something new. That call told me 3 things. First, France knows they're losing control of Africa. They're not fighting to maintain power. They're negotiating for managed decline. They're asking for time to adjust, not for us to stop. Second, France's strength is an illusion maintained by African belief. The moment African countries stop believing they need France, France has no real power. Macron admitted that if 7 nations prove they can trade independently, it will spread everywhere. Third, the next phase of French-African relations will be France trying to maintain influence through partnerships instead of control. Macron wasn't offering to keep controlling us. He was offering to transition from control to influence, from dominance to partnership, but only if we gave him time to make that transition comfortable. And I told him no, because comfortable transitions benefit the powerful, not the free. Why I'm telling you this now? You might be wondering, why am I revealing this conversation? Macron asked me to keep it secret. He said his presidency might end if people knew he was negotiating from weakness. I'm revealing it for one simple reason. Because African people deserve to know that France's power over us is an illusion, and that illusion only works if we keep believing in it. Macron called me at midnight and begged me to delay African independence. That's not strength. That's desperation. France offered to end the CFA franc if we gave them 5 years to adjust. That's not power. That's dependence, realizing its ending. France admitted their position is morally indefensible, but asked us to help them maintain it anyway. That's not dominance. That's a system begging for more time before it collapses. And I want every African watching this to understand. The colonizers aren't strong anymore. They're desperate. And desperate people make midnight phone calls begging for delays they know they don't deserve. France isn't fighting to control Africa. France is fighting for time to adjust to not controlling Africa. And we don't owe them that time. What this means for Africa's future. The West African Trade Alliance launched on February 15, 2025. 13 days after Macron's midnight call. France protested diplomatically. They warned of economic instability. They predicted currency chaos. They suggested we were rushing into untested systems. But none of it stopped. Because France's warnings no longer carry the weight they used to. In the first 30 days of the alliance, $4.2 billion in trade between member nations, zero French fees or French control, currency exchanges handled directly between African central banks, no economic collapse, no chaos, no instability, just 7 African nations trading with each other like sovereign countries do. And Macron was right about one thing: it is spreading. Tanzania is watching, Kenya is interested, Ghana is reconsidering their CFA Franc membership. Because once you prove independence is possible, others stop accepting that dependence is necessary. The lesson from a midnight call, Macron's midnight call, taught me this: power isn't what the powerful have, it's what the powerless believe they lack. France doesn't control Africa because it's strong. It controls Africa because African nations were made to believe they needed permission to be independent. The moment you stop asking for permission, you realize you never needed it. France can't force the CFA Franc trade routes or political influence. It can only make us believe there's no alternative. And when African countries actually test those beliefs, France has nothing left, only midnight calls asking for delays. My message to Africa: if France's president is calling African leaders at midnight begging them to slow down, what does that tell you about who holds the real power? If he's offering to dismantle 60-year-old systems just to buy 5 more years, what does that say about desperation? It means France's control over Africa is ending, not because we asked, but because we're moving forward as if it already has. Real power isn't negotiating for independence, it's acting independently. What I told Macron, I told him. We've already given France 60 years, 3 generations, enough time to end systems that should never have existed. You didn't end them, you maintained them, you profited from them. So no, you don't get more time. You get to watch Africa move forward without your permission. The final truth: Macron called at 12:47 a.m. He begged for delays. He admitted France's position is indefensible. And he heard no. That call wasn't a negotiation. It was a confession from a dying empire to a rising continent. France knows the power has shifted. African leaders know it. The only question is, do African people know it? Because once you see a former empire begging at midnight, you can never unsee the weakness behind the illusion of power.
Subscribe to Voice of Sovereign Africa today. Let's build a greater Africa together.